What if I told you that World War II was not just fought by soldiers on the battlefield, but by millions of ordinary people in kitchens, factories, and coal mines? That women, once bound by tradition, stepped into cockpits, sniper nests, and assembly lines, reshaping societies in ways no bomb could. Welcome to the untold side of World War II, the home front, where the real battle for survival, dignity, and purpose raged just as fiercely. This was not just a war of bullets and tanks. This was total war, a war that reached into every village, every home, and every life. Governments did not just draft men, they conscripted economies. They rationed food, took over industries, and mobilized every ounce of human labor. Children grew up under air raids. Women went from raising babies to building bombers. Entire cities became war machines, and no one was left untouched. In the Soviet Union, women were trained as snipers, pilots, and guerrilla fighters. In Britain, they became welders, tram drivers, and code breakers. In Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, traditional gender roles collided violently with the desperate need for labor and defense. The results were both inspiring and tragic. Today we dive deep into the overlooked battlefield of World War II, not the trenches of Stalingrad or the beaches of Normandy, but the homes, factories, and farms where everyday people gave everything, often without medals or recognition. If you are passionate about history that goes beyond the headlines, stories of courage, sacrifice, and transformation, this video is for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of these powerful hidden histories. Now, let us uncover how World War II changed not only nations, but the very meaning of what it meant to fight, and who could be a warrior. In Britain, as the storm of World War II gathered across Europe, the line between soldier and civilian began to blur. This was not a war fought only on distant battlefields. It came home in bomb blasts and blackout curtains, in food queues and ration books, in the quiet bravery of those who refused to crumble under pressure. The British people, often romanticized as stoic and resolute, faced a reality that tested their spirit, reshaped gender roles, and redefined what it meant to fight a war. From the moment Britain declared war in 1939, ordinary life was upended. The nation braced for impact not just militarily, but socially and economically. The government swiftly enacted measures that would come to dominate daily life, conscription not just for men, but eventually for women, censorship and propaganda to maintain morale, and perhaps most disruptively, the introduction of rationing. With enemy submarines targeting supply ships and the threat of food shortages looming large, rationing became the cornerstone of home front survival. Sugar, butter, meat, eggs, and even clothing were tightly controlled. Housewives, many of whom had never worked outside the home, were suddenly at the forefront of a domestic battle for resourcefulness. Armed with government-issued recipe books and ration stamps, they learned to stretch ingredients, make do without, and find clever substitutes. A banana became an object of wonder. A real orange, a luxury. Even wedding dresses were shared between brides or sewn from parachute silk. Yet food was only one of many daily concerns. When the Blitz began in 1940, it brought the war directly into British cities with a terrifying force. Night after night, bombs rained down on London, Liverpool, Coventry, and dozens of other towns, reducing homes to rubble and shattering any illusion of civilian safety. Families huddled in underground shelters and basements as buildings shook above them. Air raid sirens became a nightly soundtrack. Children were evacuated en masse to the countryside, separated from their families for months or even years, in a desperate bid to shield them from death from above. But amid the devastation, resilience took root. One of the most dramatic shifts came in the workforce. As millions of men were sent to the front lines, their absence created an urgent need for labor. The war industries, particularly munitions factories, boomed with activity, and it was women who filled the gap. They left their homes, their children, and their expected roles behind to take up work in conditions that were often dangerous, exhausting, and utterly transformative. These were not symbolic efforts. Women in factories built bombs, assembled aircraft, and filled artillery shells with explosive material, often at great personal risk. TNT poisoning turned their skin yellow and their hair orange, giving rise to the nickname Canary Girls. Still, they persisted. For many, this was their first taste of financial independence and public importance. They were no longer just wives or mothers. They were essential to victory. The government, initially hesitant to push women too hard, soon realized the magnitude of their contribution. When voluntary recruitment fell short, conscription followed. By 1941, unmarried women aged 20 to 30 were called up for service, whether in industry, civil defense, or the armed forces. Some joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, driving military vehicles, maintaining anti-aircraft guns, or working in communications. Others entered the Women's Royal Naval Service, WRNS, or the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAAF, performing vital roles in intelligence, navigation, and operations. Still others became land girls, part of the Women's Land Army, replacing male farm workers to keep the country fed. Their work was hard, muddy, and lonely, but it kept Britain from starving. This full-scale mobilization came at a cost. The pressure to serve, whether on the line or behind it, was immense. Many women faced a double burden, working long shifts while caring for children and running a household under increasingly constrained circumstances. Child care provisions were limited, and though the government set up nurseries and communal kitchens, they were not always accessible. The physical and emotional toll was great, but few complained. Most simply did what had to be done. Meanwhile, propaganda reinforced their importance. Posters plastered across towns bore slogans like, "Careless talk costs lives," or "Keep mum." "She is not so dumb," while others urged women to do your bit by joining the war effort. Newsreels showcased glamorous yet gritty images of women welding metal or plowing fields. The cultural message was clear. Your role is vital, your sacrifice noble, your country proud of you. And while these messages often masked the harsh realities on the ground, they gave many women a sense of visibility and purpose that had long been denied. As the war dragged on, the social fabric of Britain shifted. Class barriers blurred as rich and poor alike stood in ration queues and cowered in bomb shelters. Gender norms loosened as women gained practical experience and authority in public life. Men returned from the war to find their wives more assertive, more self-reliant, and often reluctant to return to their pre-war subservience. The seeds of post-war feminism were quietly sown in the munitions factories and Ministry of Information offices of wartime Britain. In the end, the civilian effort on the home front was not a sideshow to the grand theaters of battle. It was the backbone of victory. Without the quiet heroism of the housewife rationing sugar, the teenage girl assembling bomber components, or the land girl sowing wheat in frozen soil, the fight would have faltered. They were warriors, too, just in aprons and overalls instead of uniforms. This is the forgotten front line of World War II, a place not marked by trenches, but by tireless work, silent endurance, and unwavering spirit. And it deserves to be remembered just as vividly as any battlefield. In wartime Britain, as bombs thundered from the skies and sirens cut through the darkness, a quiet but radical revolution was unfolding not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and habits of women across the nation. These women, long relegated to the sidelines of national affairs, suddenly found themselves at the center of a national drama. In kitchens and factories, in military posts and city streets, they began to reshape both society and themselves. The war, brutal and unrelenting, forced Britain's women into new roles, and while some of these roles came from necessity, Others were chosen as acts of subtle defiance, dignity, and pride. For some women, the answer was resilience through reinvention. If their world was falling apart, they would hold it together with lipstick and elegance. These were the women who insisted on keeping up appearances even in air raid shelters, who curled their hair in the shadows of crumbling buildings and dabbed on rouge before stepping into blackout nights. It was not vanity. It was resistance. Glamour became a form of courage, a declaration that the war would not break their spirit or dull their identity. Magazines like Woman's Own featured beauty tips using rationed ingredients: beetroot for lipstick, sugar for exfoliation. The absence of silk stockings sparked a national craze for drawing fake seams down the backs of legs with eyebrow pencil. These details may seem small, but they held tremendous weight. In a world that was being stripped of softness and beauty, these women reclaimed control over their image, over how they presented themselves to the world, even as that world burned. Meanwhile, a very different transformation was happening on factory floors and airfields. Gone were the delicate gloves and floral prints. In their place came grease-stained overalls, steel-capped boots, and determined expressions. The Rosie the Riveter figure may have been an American icon, but her British sisters were equally formidable. They stepped into roles once considered unthinkable: welding, machining, explosives handling, and even maintaining warplanes. The image of the tough cookie munitions worker became a powerful cultural symbol. These women, with rolled-up sleeves and soot-smudged faces, did not just fill in for absent men. They owned their space, proving they could master the demands of industry under the most pressing conditions. The factory environment was not glamorous. It was loud, dangerous, and physically exhausting. Yet within it, something extraordinary happened. Women discovered both the power and the dignity of work. They formed friendships across class lines, learned new skills, and began to think differently about their own capabilities. Some had never touched a tool before. Now they calibrated bomb sights and assembled Spitfire engines. They knew that every rivet, every fuse, could help tip the balance of war, and that knowledge gave their labor a meaning that transcended mere duty. Outside the factories, others took on new uniforms. Members of the Auxiliary Territorial Service learned to drive military convoys, operate searchlights, and decode enemy messages. Women in the Women's Land Army drove tractors and harvested crops, often in isolation but with a fierce sense of purpose. Even those in domestic service or clerical roles found their work taking on new importance. The war was everywhere, and it had no patience for the limits of tradition. But while women were expanding their public roles, they were also navigating a complex cultural tension. They were expected to be strong, but not too assertive. Patriotic, but not unfeminine. The image of the wartime woman was often a carefully crafted balance, capable and competent, yet still nurturing and modest. This dual expectation created a unique kind of pressure. It was not enough to do the job. One had to do it without appearing to challenge the established gender hierarchy too directly. And yet, change was inevitable. Whether through necessity or quiet rebellion, the war began to loosen the grip of pre-war norms. Class distinctions weakened as duchesses and factory girls worked side by side. Male-dominated industries were forced to admit that women could not only perform the work, they could excel at it. And within many households, the power dynamic subtly shifted. A woman who could manage a home on rations, hold down a full-time job, and protect her children during air raids was no longer easily dismissed as just a housewife. This shift was not without resistance. Many men returning from the front lines found themselves disoriented by the transformation. The women they left behind were no longer the same. They were more confident, more independent, more certain of their worth. And while wartime propaganda often encouraged women to do their part, it also hinted that their newfound independence was only temporary, that when peace came, they should return quietly to the domestic sphere. But that genie could not be put back in the bottle. For millions of women, the war had opened a door, and even if society tried to close it again, something had changed forever. The experience of taking on vital roles during the nation's darkest hours laid the groundwork for post-war movements toward equality. It reshaped personal dreams, expanded professional horizons, and challenged the very definition of womanhood. So whether they fought the war with rivets or rouge, with farming tools or factory grit, British women stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. Some chose to preserve a version of femininity that gave them strength and comfort. Others embraced roles that had once been unthinkable, discovering new sides of themselves in the process. But all of them, in their own way, helped to write a chapter of history in which courage took many forms, and not all of them wore a uniform. While Britain's women were redefining themselves in factories, fields, and shelters, across the vast frozen expanse of the Soviet Union, an even more dramatic transformation was underway. Here, in a land gripped by a war of annihilation, women were not just managing the home front, they were stepping onto the front lines. Their transition from civilians to soldiers had not begun with the outbreak of war, but years earlier, as part of a sweeping Soviet vision that saw no room for traditional gender limits in the defense of the motherland. This vision, shaped by ideology and sharpened by desperation, would produce some of the most remarkable female warriors in modern history. Women who would aim rifles, drop bombs, and kill to protect their homeland. Unlike in Britain or Germany, where female mobilization was often hesitant or constrained by ideology, the Soviet state had, since the 1930s, actively promoted the idea that women could and should participate in military life. Soviet propaganda did more than just suggest this. It glorified it. Magazines and films depicted strong, capable women parachuting from planes, skiing through snow-covered forests, practicing their marksmanship with fierce determination. Girls were taught in youth organizations how to assemble rifles, administer first aid, and navigate terrain. The concept of gender equality in Soviet rhetoric may have been more political than practical, but it laid the groundwork for a total mobilization of both body and mind. When the war came, there was already an infrastructure in place, psychological and logistical, that allowed women to step forward not as a surprise, but as an expectation, and they did so in the hundreds of thousands. Following Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the scale and brutality of Operation Barbarossa left no corner of the country untouched. Soviet recruitment centers were flooded with women volunteering for service. Many were turned away at first, told, as the old phrase went, that war is not women's business. But as casualties mounted and German troops pressed toward Moscow, those same recruitment officers found themselves reconsidering. The war demanded everything and everyone. By the war's height, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Soviet women were serving in the military. Many were assigned to traditional support roles, nurses who carried wounded men from battlefields under enemy fire, or clerks who typed out dispatches as artillery shook the walls. But a staggering number were trained for and deployed into combat. These were not auxiliary personnel. They were frontline soldiers. They drove tanks, operated machine guns, and flew aircraft into enemy territory. Among the most celebrated were the women of the all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment, feared by the Germans and revered by their comrades. Flying under the cover of darkness in outdated, slow-moving biplanes made of plywood and canvas, these aviators became known as the Night Witches. They cut their engines as they approached enemy targets, gliding silently through the sky before releasing their bombs, the only sound being the whisper of wind, like the rustling of a witch's broom. Their missions were perilous, their aircraft vulnerable, and yet they flew thousands of sorties, earning deep respect and more medals per capita than nearly any other Soviet regiment. These were not women pretending to be soldiers. They were warriors, chosen not for propaganda but for precision, skill, and unwavering courage. On the ground, other women took up sniper rifles and disappeared into the forests and trenches. Their training was relentless. They learned to hold their breath for minutes, to track prey across miles, to lie motionless for hours in freezing snow. And when the time came, they killed with clinical accuracy. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was the most famous among them. At just 25 years old, she had already claimed the lives of over 300 enemy soldiers. Her name became legend, and she was sent to the United States to rally support for the Soviet war effort, where even Eleanor Roosevelt was struck by her calm strength and quiet intensity. Pavlichenko was not an anomaly. She was the symbol of what the Soviet woman could become under fire. Yet the battlefield was only one front. Back home, the absence of 34 million men conscripted into the Red Army left a gaping hole in the nation's workforce. Women filled it with tireless, often invisible, labor. They mined coal, forged steel, harvested grain, and laid railway lines. Girls as young as 12 worked in the bitter cold of Siberian factories for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, producing weapons they knew would one day be wielded by someone just like them, young, tired, and terrified. Food was nearly non-existent. Many died not from bullets, but from hunger and exhaustion. Their bodies pushed past every conceivable limit, yet still they worked, and still they carried on. In the countryside, where tractors had been seized for military use and horses pressed into transport brigades, women pulled plows by hand. They planted and reaped under skies lit by enemy bombers, with no promise of safety or sustenance. And at night, they returned to care for the old, the sick, and the orphaned, those left behind by a war that had devoured nearly everything. All of this, the bombs, the rifles, the back-breaking labor, was done without a whisper of retreat. Soviet women, whether they fought with weapons or willpower, became the spine of their nation's survival. They were not immune to fear, nor unaware of death's constant shadow, but they fought on anyway, not for ideology, not even always for country, but for the simple, staggering belief that survival was possible if they stood their ground. Their efforts would echo far beyond the end of the war. While post-war life in the USSR returned many women to traditional roles, their wartime contributions could not be erased from collective memory. The image of the female soldier, the pilot, the sniper, the steelworker, these were now etched into Soviet history, a legacy born of fire and sacrifice. In a global war that redefined the boundaries of what nations could demand from their citizens, the Soviet Union's women showed the world a new face of warfare, not only brave, but lethal, not only enduring, but essential. In the long, bitter nights of the Eastern Front, German soldiers spoke in hushed tones about a terrifying presence in the skies, ghostly bombers that flew without engines, dropped their payloads with deadly precision, and vanished into the dark before a single shot could be fired. They called them Nachthexen, the Night Witches. But these were no specters from folklore. They were young Soviet women, flying plywood biplanes held together with wire and courage, launching thousands of bombing raids under cover of darkness. These women, members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, were not merely soldiers. They were legends in the making, symbols of a new kind of warfare and of a new kind of woman. Formed in 1941, when German forces threatened to crush Moscow, the Night Witches came from the lecture halls of Moscow State University, from villages and cities, from all corners of a country on the brink of collapse. They were volunteers, many barely in their 20s, some teenagers, all determined to fight for the survival of their homeland. Denied modern equipment and dismissed by male officers who believed women had no place in war, they trained relentlessly and mastered the unforgiving art of night bombing. Their aircraft, the Polikarpov Po-2, was obsolete even before the war began an open cockpit. Wood and canvas biplane that flew so slowly it was nearly impossible to shoot down. It had no parachutes, no radios, and barely enough space for a small payload of bombs. But in the hands of these women, it became a weapon of psychological warfare. They cut their engines as they neared the target, gliding silently over enemy encampments. The only warning the German troops had was the eerie whooshing of wings like a witch's broomstick in light, followed by the shattering explosion of bombs falling from the darkness. They flew multiple sorties every night, sometimes up to 8 in a single shift, returning to base only long enough to refuel and reload before lifting off again into the black sky. Their tenacity wore down the enemy's nerves, their ingenuity made up for what they lacked in machinery, and their bravery won them more decorations per capita than nearly any other unit in the Soviet military. To their foes, they were phantoms. To their comrades, they were heroes. To the world, they were proof that gender was no barrier to glory or sacrifice. And while the night witches ruled the skies, others stalked the forests and fields below with a different kind of silent terror. These were the Soviet Union's female snipers, expert marksmen trained to kill with one shot, then disappear before the enemy ever knew where the bullet came from. They trained for weeks, sometimes months, learning to crawl across ice-covered terrain without making a sound, to regulate their breathing under the pressure of life and death, to shoot not with emotion but with methodical precision. It was a brutal job, cold, solitary, and lethal. And the most fearsome among them all was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. By the time she was 25, Pavlichenko had killed 309 enemy soldiers. A university student in peacetime, she became the Soviet Union's deadliest female sniper and one of its most celebrated wartime figures. Her battlefield exploits were the stuff of military myth, duels with German snipers that lasted for days, confirmed kills made under fire, soldiers saved by her unerring aim. But Pavlichenko was more than a killer. She was a symbol, not only of Soviet strength, but of female agency in a war that sought to erase individuality. In 1942, she toured the United States and Britain, urging the Allies to open a second front, and fighting not with bullets but with words. When asked by a condescending American journalist about whether she wore makeup at the front, she answered coolly, "There is no rule against it, but who has time to think of her shiny nose when a battle is going on?" Her fame was no accident. It was carefully cultivated by Soviet authorities who understood the power of narrative. In Pavlichenko, they saw a face to match the legend. Her calm demeanor, her sharp intellect, her deadly efficiency, all served to showcase what the Soviet ideal woman could be: educated, patriotic, and fearless. And behind her stood thousands of others, snipers, pilots, machine gunners, tank drivers, who never saw the inside of a television studio or newspaper, but who nonetheless played a vital role in turning the tide of war. What made these women extraordinary was not just their combat record, though that alone would have earned them a place in the history books. It was the fact that they achieved it in the face of overwhelming skepticism and structural resistance. Many male officers opposed the idea of women in combat. Even after being accepted into military units, women often had to prove themselves again and again, demonstrating that they were not liabilities but assets, braver, steadier, more focused than anyone expected. And time after time, they did. By the end of the war, Soviet women had not only fought many, had commanded, led units, made battlefield decisions, and been decorated with the highest military honors. Their presence reshaped the Red Army and challenged deep-rooted assumptions about gender roles. And while the end of the war brought a push to return them to domestic life, their contributions could never be fully undone. The ghosts of the night witches still linger in every quiet sky. The sharp eye of the sniper remains a warning that courage wears many faces. The legacy of these elite female fighters is more than a footnote in military history. It is a chapter written in blood, grit, and skyfire. It is a reminder that in humanity's darkest hours, heroism does not belong to one gender. It belongs to those who rise. And in the Soviet Union, when the call to rise came, thousands of women answered not behind the lines, but on them. As the thunder of war roared across the Soviet Union, consuming its cities, farmlands, and forests, It also swallowed an entire generation of men. 34 million were pulled into the maw of the Red Army, fathers, brothers, sons, and husbands, vanishing into the front lines. What remained behind was a nation hollowed out, its streets suddenly quieter, its homes half empty, and its fields left untended. But where war carved voids, women stepped in not only with resilience, but with a ferocity that defined the Soviet war effort as much as any tank or rifle. They became the nation's labor force, its backbone, its lungs and limbs. If the soldiers on the front held the line, then the women in the factories, the coal mines, and the frozen furrows of the fields kept the heart of the Soviet Union beating. Their days began before the sun rose and ended long after it disappeared, swallowed by the choking smog of industry. In the factories of Moscow, Leningrad, and beyond, women as young as 12 worked grueling 12-hour shifts, assembling munitions, forging tank parts, sewing uniforms, and manufacturing rifles. In places where men had once dominated the factory floor, women now stood shoulder to shoulder with one another, their hands blistered, their faces lined with soot and sweat. There was no time to learn slowly. Production quotas were a matter of life and death, not statistics. Mistakes meant delay, and delay cost lives. Machines ran without pause, and so did the women, eating stale bread on short breaks, nursing aching backs and bleeding fingers, too often working through sickness or injury because there was simply no one else left to take their place. Outside the cities, the picture was no less bleak. With nearly all able-bodied men gone, the burden of agriculture fell almost entirely on the shoulders of women and children. But the Soviet countryside, once lush with tractors and horse-drawn plows, was now stripped bare. The state had commandeered most machinery and livestock for the war effort, leaving women to till the earth by hand or with whatever primitive tools they could find. The soil was hard, frozen for half the year and parched the other half. Yet crops had to be planted, harvested, and shipped to feed the Red Army. There were no rations guaranteed for the women, doing this work only quotas, directives, and pressure from the party. Hunger became as constant as the cold, and in many places food was so scarce that workers collapsed in the fields from exhaustion or malnutrition. In the Donbass coal region and in the Urals, women descended into the darkness of the mines, hauling coal in conditions once deemed too dangerous even for the most hardened men. The air was thick with coal dust, the tunnels unstable, and the wages meager. But the Soviet war machine required fuel, and someone had to provide it. So down they went, mothers and daughters, some widowed, others with children clinging to life in crumbling apartments above ground. These women bore their burden not with defiance, but with grim necessity. There was no romanticism in this labor, no posters of glory. No patriotic songs could drown out the hunger pangs or the numbness in frostbitten fingers. Perhaps most devastating was that for many women, labor did not end at the factory gate or the edge of the field. After 10 or 12 hours of back-breaking work, they returned home to another shift, caring for children, nursing the sick, burying the dead. Entire families were often crammed into a single room with broken windows and a dwindling supply of firewood. Diseases spread easily, especially among the young and the elderly. Soap was rare, clean water scarcer still, and always looming over it all was the fear, the knock on the door bearing news from the front, the whispered rumors of entire regiments lost, the silence of a husband's last letter, never followed by another. And yet they endured. They endured not because they were unafraid or unaware of the odds stacked against them, but because there was simply no other choice. The Soviet Union had committed itself to total war, and in doing so, demanded total sacrifice. For these women, patriotism was not worn like a badge. It was lived every day through bleeding hands, empty stomachs, and sleepless nights. It was measured in the weight of coal lifted, in the rows of potatoes dug, in the shells assembled by the hour. It was also measured in loss, the millions of Soviet civilians, many of them women, who died not from enemy fire but from starvation, overwork, and exposure. Still, within that struggle, something radical was taking place. The traditional boundaries that had once confined women to the domestic sphere were not simply pushed, they were obliterated. Women became indispensable in a way that could never again be ignored. They operated heavy machinery, managed logistics, led agricultural collectives, and directed train networks. The war, in its brutality, offered no room for pretense. Competence, not gender, became the measure of worth. Of course, the Soviet regime often painted their contribution in idealized hues, portraying cheerful workers in propaganda posters, their cheeks rosy, their eyes gleaming with patriotic fire. The reality was far harsher. There was no glamour in frostbite, no glory in burying one's child from hunger. But even stripped of illusion, their heroism was profound. It was not the heroism of dramatic battles or last stands. It was quieter, steadier, the kind that carried nations on its back. When the war finally turned, when the Red Army began its slow march westward, retaking village after village, it did so on the shoulders of a civilian population largely female that had refused to collapse under the weight of impossible demands. Victory may have been won on the battlefield, but it was sustained by the labor of women who day after day chose to endure what seemed unendurable. Their names rarely appear in the history books. Their stories, if told at all, are often reduced to footnotes. But without them, there would have been no war effort, no army to advance, no country left to save. In the brutal calculus of total war, they were the constant variable, the unheralded force that kept the Soviet Union alive. While the Soviet Union hurled every ounce of its population, men, women, and even children, into the inferno of total war, Nazi Germany marched to a different rhythm, one driven not purely by necessity but also by ideology. In Hitler's Reich, the role of women was never truly redefined. Even as bombs rained over German cities and soldiers perished in the East by the hundreds of thousands, the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was more than a conservative ideal. It was state doctrine. Nazi ideology saw women as the biological and cultural bedrock of the Aryan race, guardians of its future through childbirth and homemaking, not through rifles and trenches. When war broke out in 1939, millions of German women were already working. Over 14 million were in the labor force. They filled roles in education, healthcare, domestic service, and industry. But their presence in these fields was not seen as part of a broader redefinition of gender roles. It was tolerated rather than celebrated, considered an extension of their domestic responsibilities rather than a departure from them. The Nazi regime framed female labor as supportive, never central work was temporary, and motherhood was destiny. Even as the demands of total war grew louder, ideology held its grip. This created a strange dissonance. On one hand, Germany needed women more than ever. With millions of men conscripted and vast resources funneled toward the Wehrmacht, someone had to keep the trains running, the fields tilled, and the factories humming. Women began to step into these roles, driving buses, operating switchboards, delivering mail, repairing equipment, and working in armaments factories. They did the work with diligence and, in many cases, quiet pride. But they were not acknowledged as equal contributors to the war effort. They were still seen by the state and society alike as women first, workers second. Unlike in the Soviet Union or Britain, where women were recruited into military units, trained to fire weapons, and even flew combat missions, German women remained largely on the periphery of direct combat, even as Allied bombs tore through cities like Hamburg and Dresden. Even as the Red Army approached Berlin, the regime resisted any large-scale militarization of women. They could staff anti-aircraft batteries, but could not fire the guns. They could operate radios and searchlights, but were denied rank or recognition as soldiers. Their uniforms, when worn, were often symbolic. Their proximity to combat was logistical rather than strategic. Hitler was unwavering in this. A woman's place, even in total war, was behind the scenes. This reluctance had consequences. It was not merely about missed military opportunity. It also bred a war effort that lacked flexibility. As the tide of war turned, and Germany's manpower reserves shrank, other Axis powers began expanding women's roles. The Soviet Union had battalions of female snipers and bomber pilots. Britain's women served in uniform, in intelligence, and in factories. Even in the United States, women were trained to ferry aircraft and decode enemy messages. But in Germany, women were still being told to marry young, bear children, and preserve German culture from the hearth. When Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, pushed for a more aggressive total war strategy, including the greater mobilization of women, he often found himself checked by Hitler's ideological rigidity. Goebbels famously demanded that the nation sacrifice comfort and entertainment close theaters, stop horse racing and frivolities, but Hitler resisted. The war, he argued, should not wholly disrupt the fabric of German life, and so the regime remained ambivalent. It expanded female labor when necessary, conscripting young women into munitions factories and agricultural work. But even at the war's peak, with Allied armies closing in from both east and west, Germany never embraced the full potential of its female population. The image of the ideal German woman was never revised. It remained stubbornly the mother in an apron, not the fighter in a uniform. Yet the reality for many German women during the war could not be so easily contained within ideology. The needs of the Reich may have been slow to catch up, but the demands of daily life were inescapable. With fathers and brothers gone, it was women who raised the children, maintained the homes, stood in endless queues for rationed food, and buried the dead from air raids. They took in refugees, patched bombed roofs, and volunteered for local relief efforts. The work was unrecognized but essential, even without guns in their hands. German women bore the weight of war in the countless small ways that history often overlooks. And still, there were exceptions cases where ideology bent, if not broke, under pressure. As casualties mounted and desperation grew, women were quietly assigned more dangerous and direct tasks. Some staffed flak towers during bombing raids. Others were deployed as auxiliaries to the Luftwaffe or the Reich Labor Service, repairing runways, assembling aircraft, or maintaining communications. A few even found themselves near the front lines, especially in the war's final year, aiding medical teams or providing logistical support under fire. But these shifts were quiet and belated, never institutionalized or publicly celebrated. The idea of women as warriors never took root in Hitler's Germany. Ironically, despite this reluctance, women's wartime experiences did, in subtle ways, begin to change the social fabric of Germany. By the time the war ended, millions of women had worked outside the home, many for the first time. They had shouldered adult responsibilities, led households, made life and death decisions in the absence of men. Their sense of agency expanded, even if the state never formally recognized it. When the Reich crumbled in 1945, it was often women, starving, grieving, but determined, who held what remained of German society together. The contradiction at the heart of Nazi policy, the desire for a modern empire built with an archaic view of gender, was ultimately unsustainable. In total war, every resource counts, and one of the most powerful, as both the Soviets and Allies proved, was the will and labor of women. Nazi Germany's failure to fully mobilize its female population was not just a moral misstep, it was a strategic one. As German women carried out their duties with strength and endurance, they were never given the titles or status they deserved. But their contributions, often obscured by the regime's ideology, were vital nonetheless. They fought the war in their own way, without weapons, without rank, but with a resolve that history cannot afford to forget. By 1944, as Germany reeled from the weight of war on two fronts, the illusion that it could win with half its population relegated to the sidelines was beginning to collapse. Cities lay in ruins, the Eastern Front was crumbling under the relentless pressure of the Soviet advance, and Allied bombers darkened the skies over the Reich. Yet even in the twilight of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler hesitated to embrace the full reality of total war, despite millions of men being pulled into the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm, despite shortages in manpower that affected every corner of the German war machine. Women were still seen through the lens of Nazi ideology as bearers of culture, mothers of future soldiers, and symbols of purity rather than instruments of national defense. And so, while necessity forced the regime to draw women into new roles, it did so quietly, cautiously, and without the fanfare or elevation seen in other nations. Women now worked the trams and trains, managed railway stations, sorted communications traffic, and labored in light industrial sectors that were once the domain of men, in the postal service, in administrative offices, in aircraft assembly lines and machine shops. German women were everywhere, yet always in the background, always as auxiliaries, not warriors. They wore uniforms, but without rank. They worked in bunkers and barracks, but were not soldiers. Their contribution, though vital, remained ideologically invisible. This shift was driven not by ideological change, but by brutal arithmetic. Germany was losing too many men too quickly. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, from the plains of Ukraine to the outskirts of Warsaw, blood was being spilled at a pace the Nazi war effort could not sustain. The factories still needed to churn out tanks, guns, and aircraft. The trains still needed to move troops and munitions. The cities, devastated by Allied bombing, needed emergency services, reconstruction crews, and communications networks. And with each passing month, fewer men were left to do the work. Yet even as women filled these critical positions, the official stance remained unchanged. They were there temporarily, filling in, not breaking barriers. Unlike their counterparts in the Soviet Union, where women flew bombing raids or picked off enemy officers as elite snipers, German women were confined to roles that, by design, could be relinquished as soon as the war ended. Their uniforms marked them as workers, not fighters. They staffed the communication centers of the Luftwaffe and manned searchlights for the flak batteries, but they were never allowed to pull the trigger. Even when they served at anti-aircraft installations, the firing mechanism was often reserved for men, even teenage boys, while women reloaded, logged trajectories, or signaled alarms. This cautious mobilization had little to do with women's ability, and everything to do with the ideological structure built into the Nazi state. Hitler distrusted the concept of full civilian militarization. Joseph Goebbels, ever the pragmatist and a more zealous proponent of total war, frequently pushed for stronger measures to mobilize the entire population. He called for the closure of luxury industries, the reallocation of labor to armaments, and the use of women not just as placeholders but as a labor force in their own right. Hitler, however, resisted. He feared the psychological effect of tearing down the image of normalcy that still lingered among many civilians. He resisted shutting down theaters, public amusements, and sporting events even late in the war, claiming that morale was best preserved by not disrupting everyday life too dramatically. And, crucially, he resisted enlisting women into combat or anything that too closely resembled it. But as the war dragged into its fifth and sixth years, reality began to encroach on ideology. In 1944, the Allied landings in Normandy and the Soviet offensives in the East stretched German resources to their breaking point. It became impossible to ignore the labor shortage. The Third Reich began to conscript women more systematically into the war economy, especially into positions left vacant by conscripted men. Young women were directed into jobs they would never have held before the war, in rail yards and repair shops, in military warehouses and control rooms. They became the backbone of logistics and operations. Some joined the Reich's Arbeitsdienst, the Reich Labor Service, digging trenches, laying wires, operating pumps in bombed-out cities, or assisting in the maintenance of airfields. Others worked in munitions factories, handling explosives and assembling deadly machines with speed and precision under constant threat of bombing raids. The conditions were grueling. But the sense of contribution was real. These women may not have carried rifles, but they carried the burden of a collapsing war effort on their shoulders. Still, the official image of womanhood in Nazi propaganda barely shifted. Posters still depicted the ideal German woman as a serene maternal figure or as a nurse tending to wounded soldiers, not as an engine mechanic or flak assistant. Even as women stepped into roles that kept Germany functioning through the chaos, the regime refused to openly acknowledge their transformation. When a German woman wore a uniform, it was symbolic. Her power remained domestic, cultural, auxiliary. She was not permitted to become a public symbol of resistance or strength in the way the Soviet night witches or American Rosies were. Her labor was accepted, even demanded, but not celebrated. By late 1944 and early 1945, with defeat looming, the regime began to quietly edge toward desperation. There were rumors and a few experimental efforts of women being trained with rudimentary weapons for local defense. Photographs emerged of teenage girls holding rifles and drills, of women practicing with bamboo spears or even kitchen tools. But there was no real infrastructure to train or deploy them in battle. These images served more as propaganda than preparation. The idea of sending women to the front as combatants clashed too violently with the core tenets of Nazi ideology. In the end, the regime chose ideological purity over survival. The paradox was tragic. While Nazi officials clung to outdated beliefs about gender, Germany's enemies weaponized every resource at their disposal. Women in the Red Army dropped bombs over Berlin. British women decoded Nazi signals that led to U-boat losses. American women built the very planes that would deliver the final blows. German women, just as capable, were left in the shadows of a war that would ultimately consume the nation. And yet, in those shadows, they worked. Tirelessly, invisibly, they kept the trains running, the machines turning, the cities breathing. Their roles may have been minimized by propaganda, but their presence was undeniable. They were not soldiers, but they were fighters. Their battlefield was the bombed-out street, the factory floor, the train depot at dawn. Their contribution, though shackled by ideology, mattered, and when the dust of war settled, it was they who would pick up the pieces. In Japan, the road to fully mobilizing women during the Second World War was one marked by hesitation, tradition, and ultimately desperation. The empire, deeply rooted in conservative ideals and Confucian hierarchies, had long viewed women as the quiet caretakers of the home, the preservers of family honor, and the nurturers of future sons who would one day serve the emperor. Unlike in the Soviet Union, or even war-torn Britain, Japanese wartime propaganda did not initially encourage women to become warriors or industrial workers. Instead, they were cast in roles that aligned with long-standing cultural ideals: homemakers, community fundraisers, textile workers, and moral supporters of the imperial project. As Japan launched its campaign of expansion across East and Southeast Asia, it did so with the confidence of military superiority, not with the foresight that war would soon turn inward. In the early years of the war, women were largely excluded from formal labor mobilization. Their contribution was symbolic, confined to scrap metal drives, sewing clubs, neighborhood associations, and the production of care packages for soldiers at the front. The government's messaging emphasized their place within the private sphere. The slogan was not one of total war, but of harmony, encouraging women to raise patriotic children, maintain the household with dignity, and support their husbands with quiet resolve. But wars, especially those waged on a continental scale, have a way of unraveling even the most rigid social fabrics. As the tide of the Pacific War turned after 1942, with defeats at Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines, the Japanese war economy began to strain under the weight of attrition. Ships were sunk faster than they could be built. Aircraft production lagged, and entire divisions of men were vanishing in brutal jungle campaigns or oceanic ambushes. The empire was bleeding resources, and its leaders knew it. Something had to change. By 1943, the labor shortage in Japan had reached a critical point. Factories producing bombs, rifles, and airplanes stood idle, not for lack of raw materials, but for lack of workers. The once taboo idea of mobilizing young women into these industrial jobs began to gain traction, not out of ideological evolution, but pure necessity. Across the country, girls were pulled from classrooms and drafted into the workforce. Teenagers, once expected to marry or serve in modest neighborhood roles, were now fitting bolts into aircraft fuselages, assembling rifles, or pouring gunpowder into munitions. The romanticized image of the self-sacrificing, homebound woman was replaced, though not publicly, with that of the industrial laborer in a factory smock, working under the dim buzz of fluorescent lights. It was an uncomfortable transformation for a society so steeped in patriarchal tradition. Propaganda struggled to reconcile this new reality. Posters began to feature young women smiling as they labored in aircraft plants, framed as daughters of the empire who were making quiet sacrifices for their brothers and fathers on the front. These images attempted to soften the radical shift occurring across the country. What was once seen as unsuitable for women, grease-stained hands, physical exhaustion, factory discipline, was now patriotic, even noble, so long as it remained temporary and did not undermine traditional gender roles in the long term. By the spring of 1945, with Tokyo in ruins and American forces pressing closer to the Japanese home islands, the tone shifted again. The United States had taken Iwo Jima. Okinawa was next. Air raids over Japanese cities became a nightly terror. Firebombs tore through wooden houses, reducing entire districts to ash. The Japanese leadership, gripped by a mix of fear and fatalism, began to prepare for the unimaginable and Allied invasion of the main islands. It was at this moment that the mobilization of women took its most extreme form. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public posters began calling on all citizens, regardless of gender or age, to prepare to defend the homeland. The government announced the formation of the Volunteer Fighting Corps, a last-ditch militia that would include schoolboys, elderly men, and, for the first time, large numbers of women. Military planners envisioned a mass mobilization of civilians, trained to resist the Americans by any means necessary. But the reality was grim. There were no surplus rifles or proper uniforms to issue these civilians. What women received instead were wooden poles, gardening tools, and, famously, bamboo spears. Training sessions were hastily organized in schoolyards and temples. Housewives, students, widows, and secretaries were taught basic drills: how to hold a spear, how to thrust it at the chest of an imagined enemy. Some women were told to gather kitchen knives or tools that could be strapped to sticks. The government insisted that this was an act of patriotism. In reality, it was a signal of how close Japan was to total collapse. Photographs from the era show these soldiers lined up in rows, bamboo weapons in hand, staring solemnly at the camera. To outsiders, these images were haunting. To the Japanese state, they were intended to inspire resilience, a show of national unity in the face of annihilation. But beneath the surface, fear was mounting. Few believed that these women, barely trained and poorly armed, could truly stand against tanks and machine guns. It was a theater of desperation, one last attempt to convince the public that Japan would never surrender, even as defeat became a certainty. The weaponization of women in 1945, therefore, was not a sign of empowerment, but of collapse. Unlike the Soviet Union, where women had been prepared for combat through years of paramilitary training, or the United States and Britain, where women were steadily integrated into industrial and support roles, Japan's embrace of female mobilization was erratic and reactive. It came too late, lacked infrastructure, and was steeped more in symbolic defiance than in practical strategy. Still, the efforts of Japanese women during the war cannot be dismissed. From the textile workers who stitched military uniforms, to the teenage girls who assembled aircraft parts under the threat of bombing raids, from the mothers who fed their families amid rationing, to those who stood in line for bamboo spear drills, These women were pillars of a nation in crisis. Their labor, though undervalued and often invisible in the official histories, helped sustain Japan through the final and most desperate years of its imperial ambition. And when the war finally ended after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the emperor's unprecedented radio address, these same women would become the quiet architects of Japan's reconstruction. They laid the foundations for a new era, one in which their roles would never again be confined so easily to the kitchen or the nursery. In the ruins of defeat, the seeds of change were sown. Total war did not merely change the battlefield. It reached into the kitchens, schools, factories, and farms of every nation touched by conflict. Civilians became soldiers without uniforms, pressed into service by necessity, ideology, or desperation. The lines between home and front blurred as bombs fell on cities, as food grew scarce, and as work became ceaseless. Those strategies, ideologies, and levels of mobilization varied from country to country. One truth was inescapable: no life remained untouched. And no group bore the weight of this transformation more profoundly than women. In Britain, women juggled motherhood with the relentless duties of the war economy. They rationed, endured bombings, kept households running, and stepped into factories where they produced the tools of war. Some wore lipstick and heels to maintain dignity amid chaos. Others donned overalls and steel-toed boots to keep production lines moving. Glamour became a quiet form of defiance, while toughness became a badge of pride. From make-do and mend to rolling ammunition carts, British women proved essential to both morale and victory. In the Soviet Union, the stakes were more existential, and so too was the demand for full participation. Since the 1930s, Soviet ideology had promoted women as equal citizens, and when war came to their doorstep, they answered the call. Women took up sniper rifles, climbed into bomber cockpits, manned anti-aircraft guns, and loaded shells with bare, frost-bitten hands. They dug trenches, harvested crops, repaired tanks, and held the line as comrades in arms. Icons like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and the Night Witches were not exceptions. They were symbols of a larger truth. In the USSR, total war meant total inclusion. In Germany, women's roles were shaped by rigid ideology and paradox. Nazi doctrine confined them to the 3 kiloseconds Kinder, Küche, Kirche. But necessity slowly chipped away at those boundaries. By 1944, German women were driving trains, operating radios, staffing hospitals, and working assembly lines. Yet they remained in auxiliary roles, carefully distanced from direct combat or military authority. Even as their labor kept the war machine alive, their status as second-tier contributors reflected Hitler's ambivalence toward a fully mobilized home front. Meanwhile, in Japan, the mobilization of women came slowly, shaped by tradition and hierarchy. Initially relegated to supportive roles, women eventually moved into munitions factories and textile mills as the war effort grew desperate. They were drafted from schools, pulled from their homes, and placed in sweltering workshops, assembling bombs and uniforms, while the empire crumbled around them. In the final days, they were handed bamboo spears and told to prepare for invasion, a grim symbol of both their importance and the government's despair. Across the globe, from the rice fields of Southeast Asia to the industrial corridors of the United States, women became essential to survival. Whether by choice, coercion, or tragedy, they shouldered responsibilities once thought impossible. They cared for the wounded, buried the dead, and rebuilt shattered homes with scarred hands and hollow stomachs. Some wore uniforms. Many did not. But all, in their own way, became warriors of resilience. Total war was not just about armies clashing or borders redrawn. It was about how ordinary people, especially women, were asked to do the extraordinary. It was about how ideologies both empowered and confined them, how fear and necessity pushed societies to their limits, and how the war's reach turned every domestic task into a contribution to victory or survival. And when the guns finally fell silent, it was these same women who helped stitch their nations back together. In many cases, they did not return to their pre-war lives, not fully. The confidence they gained, the roles they had proven capable of fulfilling, and the sacrifices they made could not be erased. The world would rebuild, but it would not go back. The war had not just changed borders or governments, it had changed people, and it had shown, undeniably, the power and potential of women in every corner of society. Thank you for watching and joining us on this journey through the hidden history of women in World War II. If you found this story meaningful, informative, or inspiring, please do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who care about learning from the past. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that deserve to be told. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and wherever you are in the world, sleep well and good night.